In July 1942, the German High Command will make one of the most consequential decisions of the Second World War, an advance towards an industrial city on the Volga River in the southern Soviet Union, Stalingrad. In August, the German 6th Army and 4th Panzer Group made their move and soon reduced much of the city to rubble. Yet, a Soviet counter-offensive in November, coupled with brutal winter conditions, saw the Axis stopped in their tracks and then surrounded. The damage was immense for both sides. Over 4 million combatants were involved and the casualties reached well into the millions. But by February 1943, it was the remaining German troops who surrendered and the Axis never fully recovered. I'm James Hanson and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different historical battle, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Battle of Stalingrad, considered by many metrics to be the largest battle of all time, one which staggeringly reduced the city's population from 850,000 to just 1,500. Was a Soviet victory always a foregone conclusion? That's a question for our experts, and joining me once again in the studio is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Parry, and for the first time on the show via video link, the historian, author and broadcaster, Jon Trigg. Welcome to you both. Well, as always on History Undone, before we get into undoing the history and exploring what the long-term consequences could have been had things panned out differently, let's go through what really did happen. Dr. Parry, to start with you, lay the land for us, set the scene. 1942, we've got our big map of Europe in front of us. Should mention Stalingrad is there. You've got the Volga River. The Axis have been making their advances through the summer of 1942. What's the state of play?
Well, in the spring and summer of 1942, Germany and the Nazi regime are feeling pretty chipper. They're dominating most of Europe. They've got an ally in Italy. They're all over the Balkans. They've got an ally in Romania. They're advancing into the Soviet Union. They've captured the Baltic states. Rommel has just captured Tobruk and put the British to flight in North Africa. The U-boat war is going really well because they have lots of fat targets as a result of America coming into the war, and they're pushing to the east. And what they're trying to establish is really the limits of the Lebensraum that Hitler has established, and that's basically European Russia. And it's a line that runs from Archangel up here off the map in the north here, all the way through to Astrakhan. And what is critical is the Volga River here that has Stalingrad in it and, of course, Astrakhan at the mouth. Why Stalingrad important? Lots of reasons. It's a big industrial and transport hub. It dominates the Volga River. Most of the oil that the Soviet Union uses in its western part comes from that region. But more importantly, if you hold the area around Stalingrad, you actually hold the left flank of any army that's going into the Caucasus to dominate the oil fields. And at this point, oil is absolutely uppermost in Hitler and the OKW, the High Command's mind. Why? Because the Navy's running out of oil, the Luftwaffe's running out of aviation fuel, and without that, the Germans can't continue the war at the pace and tempo that they are. And in fact, Hitler himself says, if I can't get to the oil around Grozny and the Caucasus, then it's all over. We might as well give up on this war. So that political industrial objective is absolutely critical and uppermost in the minds. And with pretty successful operations going on the Eastern Front, they're feeling fairly confident. Earlier in the year, they've just had a huge encirclement battle near Kharkov. They've taken out 280,000 Russian troops, and that's on top of course, a smashing victory called the Battle of Kiev in the year before. So the South is something where they've been really successful in the past 2 years, and they're very confident about pushing forward. Only snag is they're not really taking account of the losses that they've taken in men and material in achieving that, not just there, but in Army Group Centre and Army Group North up in Leningrad. And their intelligence about how the Russians are doing behind the Urals isn't very good. So they can't see how well the Russians are re-establishing those lost armies and actually putting material back into the field.
Well, John, let's bring you in on this. I mean, am I right in saying that originally the Axis plan didn't involve going for Stalingrad at all? They were just focused on the oil in the Caucasus?
Completely, James. I mean, that was, as Chris rightly said, by that stage of the war, the Nazis realised it was going to be a longer affair than they'd originally planned. And then economics comes into play. And that's all the raw materials, specifically oil, for the type of mechanised war that Blitzkrieg needed to have. So the aim of the operation, Case Blue, was always to get down to the Caucasus and to seize the Soviet oil fields and keep those for Germany. The Stalingrad operation, not mentioned, that was merely a secondary axis of advance to protect the main thrust down into the south.
OK, well, let's zoom in now and let's look at what really happened with the Battle of Stalingrad. Right, we have a new map here. This is of the southern Soviet Union. We've got the Caucasus down here, Turkey, eastern Ukraine. Some of these features might be familiar to people who are following what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. You've got the Sea of Azov, the Black Sea, and you've got Crimea as well. And crucially, Stalingrad is right here. We have the Red Army naturally represented by some red blocks, and the red arrows you can see are where the Red Army broke through, and the Axis forces represented in green. Bit of a challenge for you, Jon Trigg. Can you sum up the Battle of Stalingrad for us in about 4 to 5 minutes?
That is a challenge indeed, James, but I will give it my best shot. So Case Blue starts end of June, and the whole of Army Group South, in effect, moves flat out east. And then Hitler makes a crucial decision in about 20th of July, and that's he's going to split his forces. The Soviets are pulling back in front. He thinks they're on the run. He thinks another great victory is on the cards. So he splits the army group into two, and Army Group A, which is a mainly German affair, will head down for the offensive's main objective, which is the oil fields in the Caucasus. They're going to head for Grozny and for Maikop and so on. That's where they're going to go, and that's Army Group A. Now, Army Group B is a mixed bag. The main German elements are the 6th Army, Friedrich Paulus's soon-to-be famous 6th Army, and the 4th Panzer Army. And then it's got a long tail. It's got a long tail of allied armies that will become very important as the battle plays out. And it literally heads off into the unknown, striking across the steppe, aiming to hit the lower Volga at some point. Stalingrad's hardly been mentioned up until now. The focus is to reach the river and, as Chris said earlier, cut off the supply route for oil and grain from the southern Caspian up to the center of the Soviet Union. So 6th Army is advancing and advancing, and it reaches the Volga just to the north of Stalingrad, in the suburbs of Stalingrad, to be honest, on about the 28th of August. Now, at the same time, further south, Army Group A is just captured Maikop. So the first of all objectives, it's finally reached there, but it's running out of steam. It's on the end of a very, very long supply line. Every mile that they're going, they're using more fuel, more ammunition, which they just don't have. So it is stuttering to a standstill. Back up in the north with Army Group B, it hits the Volga River. And of course, what Germans have taken literally dozens of cities in the war so far. They know how to do it. And what they don't do is they don't tend to drive into the city centre and get involved in an urban battle where their advantages in manoeuvre and armoured warfare are nullified. So what they tend to do is clip south and north of it, and then they go round it, past it, and cut it off. Cut off in a circle, and then just allow nature to do its work. And soldiers soon get tired and hungry. They run out of bullets to fire, and then the city tends to fall. But in this situation, 6th Army its supply lines are so long that it is only faltering forward, and it can't bounce across the river. It can't carry out an encirclement maneuver. So the plan that Paulus decides on turns into it's a meat grinder. There's no other way to describe it. Stalingrad is at that stage, kind of an oddly shaped city. It's a long streak of a city from north to south, almost all of it on the western bank of the Volga, very little on the east. So he decides, what we're going to do, we're not going to get across the river and establish a bridgehead. We're going to go from north and south, and we're going to just push and push forward, meet in the middle, bang, city will be ours, job done. But in those circumstances, specifically, the Soviets realized that the battle could be turning to their advantage. They're in an urban situation that they understand, and where they're determined to hold on. So the 62nd Army, which is the main army that's involved on the Soviet side, literally is told to hold at all costs, and the Soviets start to feed troops over because they control the eastern bank. So using ferries and so on, they can literally just put troops on ferries, get them over, and just keep the battle going at tremendous human cost. For the Germans, it's a slog. It's an absolute slog. And all of a sudden, instead of advances of 60 miles a day, 80 miles a day, and so on, that German blitzkrieg tactics are used to, it's more in the hundreds of meters. It's the urban equivalent of the First World War's Western Front. And all of a sudden, key features then within the city become critical. So in the south of the city, there's a huge grain storage facility, and so on, that the Soviets turn into a strong point and is fought over for literally weeks. In the middle of the city, there's a huge mound that was put up there by Asiatic raiders centuries before, called the Mamayev Kurgan. And that is as the highest point in the city. That achieves huge focus from both sides. I think it changed hands something like 6 or 7 times during the battles in late August, September, and into October, as the Germans ground forward inch by inch, losing vast numbers of men that they just couldn't afford to lose. But at the same time, the Soviets just refused to give up. And at the same time, they are building a strategic reserve behind the front and so on, which is of huge force, because they only have to feed in enough men and material into the city itself to just keep the Germans, fighting and so on, to rob them of a clear victory. So whilst they can feed their reserves, the Germans are unable to do the same. They're having to literally push division after division into the fighting at the front, and those divisions are just getting worn down through a battle that they are not particularly well trained for, that they don't have the equipment or doctrine for, frankly, and that grind is a key to the future Soviet success. Then, in the middle of a snowstorm on the 19th of November, it all happens. It's a Soviet avalanche. Operation Uranus, or Uranus, if you want to call it that, and it happens north and south of the city. So south of the city, the Soviets realise that with the Germans focused, the Sixth Army focused in the city itself, the key they've got is what's further out, what's further to the south and further to the north in the German lines. And to the south and to the north, the German positions, they're not Germans, they're Romanians. And brave soldiers, though many of them were, they are not equipped or trained to German standards, particularly when it comes to anti-tank weapons. To the south of the city, it's the 4th Romanian Army. To the north, it's the 3rd Romanian Army. And in the storm that the Soviet Red Army unleashes on the 19th of November, the Romanians, they hold them for best part of a day. And so on, and then it's just too much, and they are annihilated. And you have the pincer movement, as is being pointed out on the map, and suddenly Sixth Army is completely lost. The fighting is going on behind them. Paulus doesn't react. He doesn't move his remaining panzer divisions to try and hold them. There's a German Panzer Corps, well, a mixed German-Romanian Panzer Corps in reserve for exactly this moment. And to be honest, a German Panzer Corps should have been able to make short work of the Soviet offensive. However, disaster for the Germans. So the Panzer Corps has got 2 elements. It's got the 1st Romanian Panzer Division, led by Radu Gerger, which its equipment is obsolete. and its tanks are pre-Second World War, and they're just not able to meet the Soviets on any sort of terminology. And then there's the poor old 22nd Panzer Division, and the guy in charge of their Panzer Regiment was a German colonel called Hermann von Oppeln-Bronikowski. Great name, love that name. Now, and half of his tanks had become unserviceable because, unbelievably, mice had actually bitten through their electric, so they weren't able to start. And in the snowstorms that they were having, they were unable to affect the Soviet attack, and the division was basically destroyed. As a bit of an aside, and I know I shouldn't do this, but Oppeln-Bronikowski was the same guy on D-Day who was commanding the Panzers of 21st Panzer that failed to reach the beaches. So interesting guy, and so on, to say the least. But the Soviet pincers then meet at Kalach on the River Don on the 23rd of November, and they capture the bridge, form a bridgehead, and that's it. So the German 6th Army, much of the 4th Panzer Army, as well as huge remaining segments, the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, are caught in an enormous encirclement. The Germans can't believe the Red Army has been able to do this. This is an operation that they've never been able to achieve before. And there's an immediate decision. It's, do we break out? Do we not? And Paulus is called on the fence. Some of his commanders say, yes, we should. Some others shouldn't. Paulus decides to stay put. And then the fateful decision is made. And it's brain fog by the German High Command. It's the only way I can see it. We'll supply this 250,000 to 300,000 men and all their equipment by air, by the German Luftwaffe transport arm, which is the stilted runt of the Luftwaffe, and it's just no way. And it's Paulus wanted 750 tons of supplies a day. The High Command said we can deliver 300. In the event, it averaged about 100 tons, and that meant specifically that the troops started to run out of absolutely everything they needed very, very quickly. Biggest thing, ammunition and fuel, because without that, soldiers are just guys wearing uniform, and then food, of course. So they start to slaughter the horses. There's 400,000 odd horses in the pocket itself. So those are soon eaten. But since they're what the Germans use to transport most of their equipment around the battlefield, that gives them a problem. So everything just kind of starts to become kind of immobile. And by that stage, the Russian winter is really got a grip. What supplies are getting through are totally inadequate. The Germans then decide that we have to try and break through. So Operation Winter Storm launches on the 12th of December. Erich von Manstein is in charge of it, and he's there to try and sweep up, sweep forward with mainly a kind of a reconstituted 4th Panzer Army to try and reach Stalingrad. At the same time, the Germans are desperately pulling Army Group A out of the Caucasus, because what they're desperately afraid of is that the Soviets will continue to advance and they'll have a super Stalingrad. And
John,
they'll
I think it's worth mentioning that Manstein himself is saying to Hitler at this time, it's not going to work, and you've got Goering saying, well, we can resupply by air, as you said. But nobody's telling Paulus this. And Paulus, as you've said, has only got 30 kilometres worth of fuel anyway. So Manstein's got to get that close. But the key point is that Manstein himself is saying, yeah, I'll go through the motions. But actually, mein Führer, this ain't going to work. And there is a danger, of course, if I get in there, I'm going to get caught as well. Yeah. He's not very happy about that.
You're absolutely right, Chris. I mean, at that time, the issue that the Germans have on their whole southern front is that it's just collapsing. They don't have a front. It's just a mess. Every single time they try and make a move, the Red Army is 2 steps ahead of them. And they've got more troops, they've got more resources. And so every time the Germans think, oh, right, we'll go forward and do this, bang, the Soviets are elsewhere and they're having to react.
And the key point, John, of course, is, the Germans rely on being a manoeuvre force at strategic level. They've managed to get themselves fixed in Stalingrad. The Russians have learned how to do manoeuvre. And that's the reversal, isn't it?
And it's the Germans looking, where can we get troops from to break the encirclement. So you go, well, maybe we'll go to Army Group Centre. Well, you can't go to Army Group Centre because they're fighting their own battle in Rzhev. And so the Soviets then launched after Uranus, Uranus's big brother, Operation Mars, to try and destroy the German Ninth Army from Army Group Centre. So Army Group Centre can't spare a beam. Army Group North can't. I mean, they've only just finished, the second battle of Ladoga, and they've destroyed the Second Shock Army, but they haven't got anything to give. So the South is just, everything is fluid. So Manstein, as you're rightly say, doesn't think it's going to work anyway, and unsurprisingly, it doesn't. And by the 23rd of December, it's over. The Germans are in retreat. Winter Storm has failed. It's over. They got within 30 kilometres, 30 miles of the southern edge of the Stalingrad pocket, and Manstein was going, Paulus, if you're going to do it, you've got to go now. And Paulus was going, well, I can't. I haven't got the fuel. I'd have to leave all my wounded, all my heavy equipment, and we'd probably all die in the snow. So that was it. And thereafter, the Germans, in effect, gave up Stalingrad, gave up the Sixth Army. And then it was more a case of, can they get Army Group A out of the Caucasus before it's cut off and destroyed? And from then onwards, it was focused on the city, and all it was death by 1,000 cuts. Literally, as the Red Army just constricted that circle around Stalingrad. And come January, the Germans in their pocket were basically immobile. They had no fuel. They couldn't move. They couldn't shoot. They run out of bullets, for goodness sake, almost. And so you had Red Army soldiers just wandering around in their trenches within sight of the Germans, but without fear of their lives, because the Germans were just unable to do anything. And it was a matter of time. And of course, the pocket was then split into two by a last Soviet attack. And by the end of January, there were literally Soviet soldiers knocking on the door of Paulus's headquarters in the basement of the Univermag store, and it was over. Paulus surrendered 31st of January, and the fighting ended 2nd of February. And that was the end of the Sixth Army and the end of Nazi Germany's strategic hopes in the south.
Jon, a brilliant summation of the Battle of Stalingrad. That's a lot to cram into just a few minutes. You did it brilliantly. Thank you so much. That's the real history. Now let's start undoing all of that history. This is History Undone. OK, Dr. Chris Parry, I want to start with you when we do this undoing of history. And of course, we'll come on to the long-term consequences of what the world might look like now had the Nazis succeeded in Stalingrad. But could they have? I mean, they came very close. They had about, 95% of the city at one point. Chuikov's 62nd Army was kind of holding on, had about 150 metres between the enemy line and the river. So could they have gone all the way? Could the Nazis have taken it?
I think, as Jon mentioned earlier, the normal German way of doing things would be to bypass the city and actually starve it out. And that's what they could have done. I think what we've got here is a classic situation where people are forgetting what the strategic aim is. The strategic aim is actually go and get the oil and actually concentrating on getting down here and putting a screening force up here to be able to deal with the Soviet armies would have been probably the best way to do it. Also, ensuring your supply lines from here, for example, very difficult indeed if you don't actually secure those supply lines. So if they'd have actually gone for a full-blooded campaign, what I think they were worried about is this huge gap between Army Group Centre and Army Group South, which became Army Groups A and B and then Army Group Don afterwards. And you can almost see in the way the German General Staff plans all the way through the 20th century, they're absolutely paranoid about actually having a gap in their front anywhere.
Yeah.
They saw it in the First World War and what happened to them then, and they're, again, really wary of actually opening this up and allowing the Russians to drive through here and cut them off to the west.
So the error was going for Stalingrad in the first place. They had to control the lower Volga. They had to do something there, but they shouldn't have got pinned down at Stalingrad.
Well, the problem is that it became totemic. One thing we haven't mentioned so far is the military aspects of it became almost irrelevant because Stalin said, well, look, the city's named after me. I really don't want to lose it. And meanwhile, Hitler was saying, well, it's named after Stalin, so let's get it.
Yeah.
And And so I'm afraid to say the city itself became the aim rather than the strategic aim more broadly in the southern theatre. And what it enabled the Russians to do is to honeypot the Germans. They managed to cut off their aviation supplies, but also their fighter aircraft and bombers that were being used to pound the city. And they brought up huge amounts of artillery, not just the usual sort of tubed artillery, but also Stalin organs, these famous rockets that go through the air and hit you at a considerable distance. And one thing you read in the diaries and letters of the Germans is the shocking noise and impact of these rockets coming in. So we're seeing a new form of Russian warfare, which involves manoeuvre and also very, very heavy use of artillery and eventually aviation. Ironically, this was the doctrine that the Russians had in 1937 before the major purge by Stalin of the high command of the Soviet army. This was exactly how they were planning to fight a war, and it was discarded during the first part of the war, and here it is back again. And as you can see from the arrows on here, the subsequent successes are all down to that combination of firepower, manoeuvre and mass that actually the Russians bring to the party. But, the Germans had a chance if they'd been able to, as I say, dominate the oil fields, develop the logistics to the west and screen off here to the north. I'm sure that actually it would have extended the war quite significantly.
Jon, let's bring you in. Do you agree with Chris there? Do you think the issue almost was that they put too much attention on Stalingrad and just got bogged down there?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I mean, Hitler had his conversation with Friedrich Paulus back in June with one of his classic kind of ultimatums, going, "Oh, if I don't get the oil from the Caucasus, then I must end the war."
Yeah.
And so on. And there he is, August, 2 months later, going, "Never mind the Caucasus oil. I'm not interested anymore. I want that city." Everything's focused on the city, and total loss of where the objective is and what you're actually aiming to do. Germans then become fixated on the city because Hitler is. Of course, one of the fascinating aspects about the Russo-German War was that it flipped completely. From when the war started, it was a military-led campaign on the German side by generals who used maneuver warfare against a Soviet side that had moved away from that, and it was Stalin overruling his generals to say hold at all costs, and losing again and again. And then at this point, the flip then turns, and all of a sudden there's the Soviets. Stalin is listening to his generals who are saying maneuver, firepower. And the Germans, the generals aren't being listened to anymore. Hitler's in charge and he's saying hold at all costs, and then starts to lose dramatically. And Stalingrad was the first of those. His we must hold no matter what. And he as a dictator, it was rutting of heads, the absolute rutting. Two dictators over this one city. And for Stalin, it was manna from heaven.
And in fact, early on, Paulus, to be fair to him, actually saw this about to happen.
Yeah.
He says, I want to go back to the River Don. I'd like to go back to here.
He wanted to retreat, yeah.
And so if I can do that, I can actually hold. I can also then manoeuvre into the Caucasus to help out Army Group A if we have to. But that was rejected, as Jon says, by Hitler. And there's a real turnover of generals in the high command at this stage as well, back in the headquarters. So it's all getting very confusing. They're all moaning at each other and saying this is the wrong thing to do. I mean, Kleist, one of the original generals in the south here during the great victories, said, Stalingrad's just a point on the map. It's got no significance in military terms at all to us. And you see in the debriefs of the German generals at the end of the war, when we got hold of them, they all said, Stalingrad, we were all saying, we're not interested in the city. We really aren't.
But maybe it comes back to the name again. It's hubris, it's Hitler fixating on it, it's Stalin fixating on it to a certain extent.
But again, it's back to pure military doctrine. You've lost sight of the aim. And, the first principle of war is, you actually have an unambiguous and you have a single aim. And that's what the Germans failed to maintain.
Jon, I want to ask you about the supply lines in just a moment. Chris, though, we probably should mention the Luftwaffe.
Yep.
I mean, complete failure.
Well, I think one has to bear in mind the Luftwaffe is really spread around Europe at this stage. There's a lot going on. So they're not just committing transport planes, they're actually committing their bombers as well. So you've got quite a lot of bombers being used for transport, and they're not very good. They're having to use planks to offload stuff. And bear in mind, aircraft aren't great for transporting fuel or ammunition because there's a lot of weight. So where they fail basically is to maintain a land corridor to be able to bring their supplies across. And of course that takes up a lot of troops and protection. There's partisan activity, there's isolated Russian army units and things like that. But the poor old Luftwaffe, they start off actually having a great time of it in Stalingrad.
Well, they raise the cities to the ground pretty
bombing
much.
It, every day. I mean, 3,000 tons of bombs alone in 1 week. So you're right, they absolutely took 90% of it out, and they were doing very well. Soviet Air Force, nowhere to be seen initially. They've been driven from the skies by basically German fighters. But unfortunately, what's happening is you get more and more unserviceable aircraft sitting to the west here, and more they're going to have to be used to take casualties out. And so, as Jon says, these truckies get shot out of the sky, they lose their airfields, they're running out of fuel themselves, and it's getting very difficult to maintain it. So they just fade away. And indeed, what we have to remember is that 30,000 troops actually were taken out by air. So they're shuttling, right to the end in some ways until their airfields are gone. But, you read stories towards the end of whole squadrons of German aircraft being destroyed either on the ground when the Russians arrive or being destroyed en route in or out. So this encirclement takes in everybody. There's enough bad to go around.
Jon, is there anything the Germans could have done to avoid their supply lines being quite so stretched?
The answer would be to set limited objectives that are actually achievable within the resources that you've got. And that was what they did not do. I mean, Chris absolutely rightly pointed out, for the Germans, the issue in the Soviet Union was not enough troops and not enough material and too much space. They simply just didn't have the mass to cover the ground that they wanted to cover. And logistics was never, the Wehrmacht's forte and so on. If you were a bright young officer going into the Wehrmacht, you didn't want to end up in logistics and so on. That was where careers went to die. You wanted to be in the front line. You wanted to be in a Panzer division and so on. You wanted to be in a Premier infantry unit. So all of their brains and their quality went towards the fighting arms, not into logistics. Funny enough, the Americans in particular reversed that, and they were superb at logistics, unsurprisingly. At that time, the Germans relied, in terms of this, on railways. That was their biggie. If you want to move mass and so on, particularly ammunition and fuel, which are your bulky items, then you put it on a railway. And they're invading a country in the Soviet Union that didn't have the same railway gauge as they did. So literally every mile that you go, you've got to change the railway gauge as you go, or you've got to take everything off your European train and so on and put it onto a Russian train, which is just incredible.
Yeah.
If you don't do that, it's on the back of a truck. And that's using fuel. So it's got fuel in the back, but it's using half of it to get where you want it to go. And of course, those roads are mainly sand and rutted mud and so on. And after 100 miles, your truck breaks down anyway. It's just a logistical nightmare. So trying to get the sheer volume and weight of supplies forward for everything that you needed is going to be almost insurmountable. I mean, it comes down to horses. The Germans, the German army in the Second World War, everyone's got this idea of blitzkrieg. Everyone's in a tank or a half-track or whatever. But the vast majority of them were actually marching or being pulled by a horse. And of course, a horse needs to eat kind of every day. And horses, I've never had one, but blimey, they really do eat a lot.
Well, and the point about food, Jon, it's an interesting one because you often hear people say, oh, well, the Germans, they didn't have appropriate clothing, they didn't have enough food. Would that have made that much of a difference? I mean, clearly it helps, but ultimately I'm guessing what they really need is ammunition.
Yes, it would have helped. And the nightmares and horror stories that came out of Stalingrad. I mean, the Germans had their first case of one of their soldiers starving. It was 20th of December. Horrific, absolutely horrific. And then it's not just an isolated case; hundreds are starving to several thousand in effect, and they've lost most of their winter clothing because unlike the previous winter, they had some in store, but those stores were overrun. and so that had gone. So it would have made life a lot more comfortable for the soldiers. It would have perhaps lengthened the resistance they've been able to give. But you've got, if you're going to shoot a soldier, a Russian soldier, you have to do it with a gun and a bullet rather than with a furry cap and a loaf of bread.
Chris, final thought from you on how the battle itself could have played out differently. Are there things the Germans could have done differently to guarantee a victory?
Well, don't go visiting Stalingrad would have been my view. I mean, I think that was the issue. I mean, what I find interesting about this, if you look at the way the awards were made by the Germans in relation to the Eastern Front, if you look at the Knight's Cross or the Iron Cross, this is the neck decoration they wear. They're given for the number of prisoners you take, not for the amount of land you take. So there's actually a lot of perverse incentives here going on. So, the more Russian prisoners you get, and that's happened, of course, in the previous 18 months or so, lots of these crosses appear. But the land taken doesn't seem to apply. Believe it or not, it's the same at sea. U-boat commanders are getting a Knight's Cross for sinking 100,000 tons or a battleship or an aircraft carrier. So they're claiming a lot of tonnage being sunk. And of course it isn't. And so the Germans think they're doing better than they are. At sea, and it's the same on land. The criteria for success are actually quite wrong.
Yeah,
Perfect.
Chris, you're absolutely right, and it's the same in the air. So in the Luftwaffe, Chris talked about it earlier, where the Germans at Stalingrad had the advantage in the air, and to do that they had to concentrate pretty much every spare aircraft they could get from across the continent, because they're still having to fight us over the Channel and of course the Desert Air Force and so on. But of course those fighter pilots in particular, you get your medals for how many planes you shoot down.
Yeah.
So your incentive is, I don't care if we win or lose, I just want to shoot down as many planes as I possibly can. So it turned the Luftwaffe in the East in particular, and Stalingrad was no different. It turned a small corps of pilots called Experten in German terminology into just killing machines. They were incredible, and they reached scores that will never be beaten in the history of aerial warfare. You're in the hundreds, whereas for the Royal Air Force and so on, our top fighter pilots, it's 20, 30 aircraft. For the Germans, if you don't reach 100, you're not even in the game. Yeah. And of course that's what it is. It's all perverse incentives. Take prisoners, sink ships, knock planes out of the air. Doesn't matter if you win or lose. Just do that, and you'll get your rewards.
Okay, Chris. One last question, and then we're going to talk about the long-term implications. Are we really saying that the moment they went for Stalingrad, their entire plan was coming undone? That was the mistake.
No, the mistake was actually not knocking it out in one go. If you'd have gone in there, taken it very quickly, knocked it on the head, been able to dominate the industrial region. And one of the interesting things is the industrial region in Stalingrad is turning out tanks during the siege, and those tanks are going straight from the factory to fight the Germans. And they're having to sight the shells along the barrel because they haven't got any sights for them. So it continues. If they'd have knocked it out straight away, pushed it aside, it wouldn't have been a problem. The fact they had to hang around, do the tourism bit, I'm afraid, did for them.
OK, let's get involved in what we really love doing on History Undone and looking at what the long-term consequences would have been had the Battle of Stalingrad played out differently. OK, we've zoomed out. We're back with my favourite map, the big map of Europe. Just to remind us, Stalingrad is just over there. Dr. Chris Parry, to pick up on the point you've just made, you think the Germans could have won at Stalingrad. They should have just knocked the city out early on. Had that happened, talk us through the consequences for the rest of the war.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things. What we've got to remember at the time of Stalingrad happening, and let's say they did capture the city in the early autumn of 1942. In November, of course, El Alamein happens in North Africa. So Rommel gets knocked out of the game. But what's really interesting about this is the whole ambition for actually striking Egypt, the Suez Canal, and then coming round into the greater Middle East here, of course, falls apart at El Alamein. But if you manage to hold Stalingrad and this line between Archangel and Astrakhan, and you can actually screen the Russians away from the Caucasus, not only can you consolidate in the Caucasus and take the oil and the resources of Kazakhstan, which are quite close as well, you can then actually go down to the south. And you don't need to take my word for this. if you listen to General Allenbrook's diaries, he says at the end of 1942, we were in a really bad way. You know, the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't going that well because of the U-boat campaign. Before Alamein, Rommel was on the march, and the Germans were at their greatest extent in Europe at that point. And he said Stalingrad transformed that, because what could have happened is they could have struck down here into Iran and taken Abadan, which is on the neck of the Gulf, and was the place through which all the oil that supplied the British Empire in its fighting capacity came through. And Allenbrook says if they'd have been able to take Abadan, we'd have been out of the game. There was also the possibility, and the Russian archives tell you this, that Turkey then would have come on side with the Axis, and you'd be able to link up with Japan to threaten the Indian Ocean as well. So the alternative plan to Barbarossa, which the German Navy favoured, was to actually have an Eastern Mediterranean strategy that came in through here. Instead of doing it through the Eastern Mediterranean, which became possible after El Alamein and after the Italians decided they didn't want to play at sea, actually could have been implemented by consolidating here in the Caucasus, going down through Iran and destroying our ability to use fuel. And if the Germans had been successful at Stalingrad, just think of all the resources in manpower, aviation, and armies that they could have actually put elsewhere. And of course, that includes, let's have another go at Britain.
I mean, that is truly fascinating. You mentioned El Alamein there, Chris. Just to mention, we did a brilliant episode on the Battle of El Alamein, the second Battle of El Alamein, a few weeks ago. Go and check that out. John, to bring you in, what do you make of what Chris is raising there? I mean, some pretty big what-ifs.
Absolutely huge. And the possibility is definitely there. I mean, the strategy of striking down through the Caucasus, well, shipping through the Caucasus and hitting the kind of the British in the rear in the Middle East and taking the Iranian oil fields and so on. A lot of Germans thought that was going to happen for Barbarossa.
Yeah. So
when they were all being shipped east in the early summer of 41, the spring and early summer of 41, in their diaries and letters home, they were all going, oh, great, the Soviets, who, of course, are their allies at that point, they're going to let us through. You know, we're not going to invade. We're going to be shipped through and down through the Caucasus. And lo and behold, Turkey's going to join us and so on. And we are going to charge through the Middle East. And that will be the end of Britain and her global empire. She'll sue for peace. And then, you know, the war, as far as we're concerned, is over. Were the resources there for that? Kind of who knows? And so, but the strategic possibility was most definitely there. And if they hadn't been fixated on Stalingrad, or that, as Chris rightly stated, if they got over it first and then moved again a balance of forces down into the Caucasus to push that offensive forward, then that's a distinct possibility.
And bring the Turks on board, John. You've got a massive army as well to actually help in this region, and you recreate what was happening during the First World War. Having said that, you know, the Turks at the time, if you look at the documents in Turkey, they're saying, look, you know, we've got to wait and see how the Germans work out. It didn't work out for us that well at the end of the First World War, so let's just wait and see. So Stalingrad is really important. The other thing that could have happened, of course, is if they won at Stalingrad and started to come down into the Caucasus, the Japanese might just have said, you know what, we'll declare war on Russia now. And,
really?
Yeah, and we'll have a go at them from Manchuria.
Even though they're already by this point at war with the US, you think they would actually declare war on the Russians?
Yeah, we've got to remember that, you know, the Pacific War was run very much by the Imperial Navy. The land war in China and on the Russian border was run by the army, and different agendas. But actually, Japan might just have fulfilled the tripartite agreement by saying, look, Germany's really successful on the western side of Eurasia. Let's have a crack on the eastern side ourselves now. And we'll join up together in the Indian Ocean and so forth. And let's go back, James, to why Midway was so important again in the middle of 1942, in actually pushing the Japanese back. So if we can't advance anymore in the Pacific, let's consolidate in East Asia and let's go for Russia.
John, I mean, I don't know what your take is. I can almost sense a slight raised eyebrow at the prospect of Japan declaring war on the Soviet Union.
I mean, it's one of the great imponderables of the Second World War is why did Hitler declare war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, and you know, did the obviously tripartite pact? Did he feel bound by that? But did Hitler ever feel bound by any pact? That he signed. He definitely didn't feel bound by the Nazi-Soviet pact and so on that he signed. However, Chris is absolutely right. Diplomatic traffic, between Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany at the time was saying, yeah, if you carry on doing really, really well, i.e. the Germans, then yes, we'll come in. And then if that had happened, then instead of Nazi Germany facing the horrors of a two-front war, which was always Germany's, and still is, always Germany's fear, so it would be the Soviets that would be facing it. And that would utterly transform the face of the war. Because, the ability of the Soviet Union to just sit behind the Urals with their economic industrial base and continue to fight the war on an attritional basis just wouldn't have been possible. And I think this is the thing for the Germans. It was important not to lose Stalingrad and so on. Losing Stalingrad was militarily for them as well as human cost was an absolute dreadful one. The Soviets could afford to lose it and so on, and still have options because as Chris rightly pointed out beforehand, what you've got there is the potential that they can then regroup, and if the Germans are focusing down south into the Caucasus, then they can, launch a huge offensive to pinch off, to reach the Sea of Azov at Rostov and what have you, and create a super Stalingrad and so on that could lead to the collapse of the German front in the east. But who knows on that front? I think, for me, in essence, it would have given the Germans some strategic options. But I mean, a question I'd always ask is, would Hitler have taken them? Because, in his head, the two enemies that he always wanted to defeat, firstly, France. He fought France in the First World War. He was desperate to beat them and so on. They were Germany's arch enemy, the Erzfeind, as they say. And then it was ideological. It had to destroy Soviet communism. Would he have wanted to destroy the British Empire in that way? Or perhaps, just threaten it and then another olive branch to Churchill, or if Churchill had survived, and say, join us in peace, and you'll keep your empire, and we'll rule the rest of it.
I think there's a couple of things here. Let's just say Japan did come in on the side of Germany. Okay, so the three ways in which Russia was supplied by America and ourselves during the Second World War were through Iran, through Vladivostok and the Pacific, and of course up to Murmansk. If the scenario played out as I said, two of those routes would have been denied to Russia. Would Russia have been sustainable in terms of war material without those supplies coming through? And remember, those bombers and that fuel are now available to interdict what's going up to Murmansk. So the Germans can consolidate themselves here in Western Europe if they draw the line. And I take the point that John says he wants to destroy Bolshevism, but they can actually consolidate all of this here, use the resources of it, and say, come and get us.
But surely, Chris, even if they do take Stalingrad, they are going to come unstuck somewhere else.
Well, where's that going to be, James?
Well, this is it. Who knows?
They're not weak. They're running out of manpower. There's no doubt about that. But if they can hold the line here, where else are they going to be vulnerable? Because they're quite well established here. The pressure is not coming from Russia in the same way it was before. At what point does Stalin say, you know what? I think I'll take a breather now. I might come back in a couple of years, but I might take a breather.
But this is a vast expanse to defend. And of course, they've got pressure coming in the next year or so from its Western Front. So,
well, is there going to be a Western Front?
You think the Western Front doesn't open up?
Well, it looks very risky, doesn't it? At the end of the day, the defeat at Stalingrad, I would say, is more important than actually Operation Torch in North Africa that takes place at the end of the year. Because in terms of actually directly threatening what the Germans hold dear, which is this fuel, I think Hitler rightly saw this fuel issue as being absolutely vital. When you've got the Tirpitz, for example, in northern Norway, having to say, look, I can only sortie 3 times this year because I don't have enough fuel. That's a real problem. And the aviation is in the same place. The actual war machine that Hitler is generating here cannot survive without fuel. And they're being really deprived of it. So they have to get hold of that. So it's absolutely critical.
John, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's Without a doubt. I mean, the issue, Western Front, obviously, there's the D-Up attack in August 1942 that obviously failed, and a lot of Canadians in particular were killed. So that kind of knocked the head on a Western Front opening in 42 and 43 as well. I think what would have happened if the Germans had been successful on that front, it would have actually, perhaps one of the biggest things that would have come out of it, would have given Stalin and the Soviets a decision to make. So as Chris said, could they kind of go, okay, we'll accept that, we'll sit back and so on, hold on to what we've got and to regroup, or do they have to try and seize the initiative? Because the war from the start in the East, from 22nd of June onwards, is one of the Germans having to keep the initiative to how do we win this? How do we beat the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union just has to survive. It doesn't have to beat the Germans. It just has to exist. But if in scenario that we've painted now, if the Russians are being Soviets are being starved of fuel, as we've said, they're only getting things through Murmansk and so on, then perhaps they've got to go guns out, and their issue is we have enough reserves and so on and resources to do one huge all-out offensive. Where is it going to be? And that would hugely turn the tables, because it's always the Germans who are having to decide that, as they did the summer, obviously that summer offensive in Kursk. The Soviets never had to decide where's our main offensive going to be until they were in the driving seat in late 43, 44 and so on. And for the first time, it would give the Soviets something to think about. Do they go all out to cut off the Caucasus and so on, and beat the Germans in the south, and hopefully their entire line in the east will then be destroyed?
Final question for each of you. I'll start with you, John. If Stalingrad is won by the Germans, does that affect the overall outcome of the war?
For me, all it does is lengthen the war for a relatively short period of time. I think the German lack of resources, their ambiguity about where their objectives are, their inability to match those objectives with the resources that they've got, would mean that over time they would have just been in an intolerable situation, and attrition would just grind them into dust. Chris, same question to you.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the big things about Stalingrad is the huge uplift in morale that the Russians get at actually finally being able to defeat the Germans and actually march them through cities and say, look, we've just taken 100,000 prisoners and things like that. And so the momentum starts to build after that. Now, that wouldn't have happened if the Russians hadn't have won at Stalingrad. I think there's a combination of things happening at the end of 1942, and we hinted at it earlier. Rommel gets defeated in North Africa. Stalingrad happens. It's the biggest conflict in the pre-atomic age in terms of casualties and scale and things like that. So we've got a massive battle that's taken place. And I think there's a step change in mood at this point. And as you look, if you're on the Allied side, you're saying 1943 is actually looking quite good because the Russians are advancing. They've just destroyed a huge army. There's quite a lot of material been lost. Momentum, morale has been lost on the German side. We're clearing the Mediterranean now. It actually looks like it's coming together. So I agree with John that even if they'd taken Stalingrad and possibly consolidated themselves in the Caucasus, a lot of things would have had to go wrong for the Allies, for the Germans to actually prolong the war more than about a year, 18 months, I would suggest.
Well, this is fascinating. I think we can probably say that had the Battle of Stalingrad played out differently, had the Germans captured Stalingrad, then certainly things would have played out differently for the rest of the war, potentially have the Germans going down into Persia, even capturing the Persian oil fields. You may well have a situation where the Western Front doesn't open up in 1944. You could have a situation even where Japan declares war on the Soviet Union. What would the impact have been of that? But ultimately, the Nazis would have come unstuck at some point. And even if the war was extended by a few months, maybe a year or so, in the end, the fundamental outcome of the Second World War probably would have been the same. That's all we've got time for today, I'm afraid. My thanks to Jon Trigg and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. We will be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone with James Hanson on YouTube. And you can also catch me presenting Frontline on Times Radio. That's it from us. Goodbye.